He'd been in Maine for barely a week, staying at a quiet and overlooking Bar Harbor's jagged coastline, but already the townsfolk had started whispering, not in the usual, breathless way they did when celebrities pass through. No, this was quieter, more curious, as if they knew something they shouldn't. Brad had shown up unannounced, no entourage, no cameras, just a dusty gray pickup with California plates and a look in his eyes that didn't quite match the polished smile they were used to seeing on magazine covers. The woman behind the front desk, Eileen, who just turned 60 and swore she'd never be rattled by a handsome face again, felt her hand tremble slightly when he looked her in the eye and asked for a room under a name that wasn't his. He called himself Jonathan. Not John, not Johnny, Jonathan. It rolled off his tongue in a way that sounded practiced, but not insincere. He checked into roommate, the one with the sea view, and the cedar-lined closet that still smelled faintly of the poet who'd lived there for a summer in '87. Eileen gave him the key and said nothing. But that night, after her shift ended, she walked to the window of roommate from the outside, just to catch a glimpse. He was sitting by the window in a white t-shirt and dark jeans, barefoot, his knees drawn up slightly like a boy deep in thought. A glass of red wine sat untouched beside him. The ocean wind pressed gently against the glass, and for a moment Eileen felt like she was looking at a ghost trying to remember how to be alive. No one in town asked questions. That's the kind of place Bar Harbor was: respectful, quiet, protective of its visitors, especially the broken ones. And Brad, or Jonathan, was clearly broken. On the third day, he started walking the shoreline every morning. At first, alone. Then, without realizing it, he fell into step with someone else. Her name was Lydia. She was 63, recently widowed, and spent her mornings walking the same trail to keep her husband's memory close. She wore a faded Red Sox cap and carried an old camera around her neck. On him, she didn't recognize him. Or maybe she did and didn't care. Either way, she nodded politely, stepped aside, and kept walking. But on the fifth morning, when a gust of wind knocked her cap off and sent it rolling down the rocky beach, he was the one who chased after it. He handed it back to her without a word. Their fingers brushed. She smiled. He nodded. And that was how it began. Lydia didn't ask him why he was there. She didn't ask why he wore sunglasses even on cloudy days or why he flinched when dogs barked too loudly. She didn't need to. She'd been through grief, through love, through years of silence that could speak louder than any confession. So they just walked, day after day, side by side. No questions, just footsteps and the soft rhythm of waves. On the eighth day, he spoke. "My kids used to love building driftwood forts," he said quietly, eyes scanning the shore. Lydia didn't answer. She just reached down, picked up a piece of smooth, pale wood, and handed it to him. That afternoon, they built one together, simple, crooked, wind-bitten. But when they finished, he stepped back and looked at it like it was the first thing he'd created in years that felt real. He never said his name, never mentioned Hollywood or movies or any of the glittering pieces he used to be made of. But that night, Lydia Googled him. She stared at the screen long after the photo loaded, him in a tuxedo at Cannes, laughing, radiant, surrounded by flashbulbs, and then looked out her window at the same man, sitting barefoot again, alone by the sea. And she said nothing. The next morning, she brought him coffee. That was the morning everything changed. That morning, he smiled. Not the tight, polite curve of his lips he gave the innkeeper or the blank one he wore to avoid recognition. No, this one was different. It crept slowly, uncertainly, like a sunrise pushing through thick fog. And Lydia, holding two steaming mugs and still in her worn blue cardigan, saw it and said softly, "There you are." He didn't ask what she meant. Maybe he knew. They sat together on the wooden bench outside the inn, the wind combing through her silver hair as he sipped his coffee. For a long while, there was no need for conversation. Seagulls shrieked overhead. The tide crept in. And somewhere down the road, a screen door creaked open and shut again. Then he said, "It's been a long time since someone made me coffee without expecting something." Lydia looked at him. Not like a fan, not like a stranger trying to be polite, but like a woman who had once loved a man who hid his sadness in the quiet. "I didn't make it for Brad Pitt," she said. "I made it for Jonathan." He turned his face away, but not quickly enough to hide the shimmer in his eyes. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of the cup. "My real name's William, you know. William Bradley." "Still too long for a coffee cup," she said, and made him laugh for the first time in what felt like years. They began meeting in the evenings, too, watching the horizon dissolve into gold and fire, neither pushing the other for more. He helped her fix the broken gate in her garden. She showed him how to make blueberry pie the way her grandmother had, with cold butter and an extra sprinkle of sugar on top. One night, while chopping wood behind the inn, he asked her quietly, "What did he die of?" Lydia didn't pretend not to understand. "Pancreatic cancer," she said. "It took him fast, but not fast enough." He nodded, and they stood in silence. That night, he left a single white daisy on her porch railing. No note, no signature, but she knew. A week later, a photographer showed up at the diner. Not a tourist, not local. Young, impatient, holding a phone and scanning every booth. Brad froze when he saw him. He dropped his fork. The air snapped like a wire under tension. Lydia saw it too. She stood up, walked over to the photographer, and with the sharp calm of a woman who had buried more than one secret in her lifetime, said, "There's nobody here worth chasing. Just ghosts and coffee drinkers." The man laughed awkwardly, but something in her stare made him think twice. He left. Brad couldn't speak for a long time afterward. Later that night, they sat in her backyard under a canopy of stars. A portable radio hummed softly beside them, playing Sinatra. She poured him a little bourbon, just enough to warm the throat. "My life doesn't belong to me anymore," he said. "It's like I sold it off in pieces. To the studios, the tabloids, even my marriages. And now I don't know what's left." Lydia took a long breath. "Maybe you just need to live where no one's buying." They stayed quiet after that. But something shifted between them. Not romance, not yet, but trust, and something heavier beneath it. Like two boats drifting closer, unsure whether to anchor or drift. The next morning, his room was empty. No note, no suitcase, no footprints in the sand. Only the driftwood fort still stood, and a blueberry pie cooling on the windowsill of room 8, with a daisy tucked into the crust. The pie went untouched for 2 days. Lydia didn't throw it out. She just left it there, on the windowsill, as if some part of her believed he'd come back to claim it. Each morning, she brushed the crust with a little sugar water to keep it soft, and each evening she sat beside it, not crying, not waiting, just being. On the 3rd day, it rained. A slow, gray kind of rain that soaked the trees without a sound. Lydia wrapped herself in her husband's old army jacket and walked the shoreline anyway. The driftwood fort had collapsed in the storm, half of it swept away, the other half caved in like a ribcage that had lost its breath. She didn't rebuild it. That night, the phone rang. She almost didn't answer. No one called her that late. When she finally picked up, there was silence on the line. Then a voice. Rough. Quiet. Familiar. "I'm sorry I left like that." She closed her eyes. The pie sat behind her, still warm from the oven she couldn't stop turning on. "I thought maybe you'd done it before," she said. "Walked away from people who made things too real." There was a pause. Then he whispered, "Yeah, I have." She waited, giving him space. "I went to see my kids," he finally said. "Told them some truth I'd been too afraid to say out loud. About who I was. Who I want to be." The wind howled across the line. She could hear waves again. Maybe he was calling from another shore. "You sound different," she said. "I feel different." Another long pause. "I'm coming back," he added. "If you'll let me." Lydia didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She just said, "You'll need to fix that fort." Click. He returned 2 days later, just before sunrise. This time, there was no hiding. No sunglasses, no fake names. When Eileen saw him, she didn't blink. She just handed him the same room key and said, "You're late. The pie's probably gone bad." He smiled and kissed her hand. That afternoon, the fort was rebuilt. Bigger, stronger. And Lydia helped him build it, not as a memorial, but as a beginning. It wasn't a love story. Not yet. But something was growing between them, slowly, like ivy over old wood. She began calling him William. And he began calling her every morning, even when they didn't meet. They talked about everything, how her late husband snored like a freight train, how fame made him forget what his own handwriting looked like, how neither of them could ever sleep on airplanes. They laughed. They disagreed. One night, she yelled at him for overcooking the scallops. He stormed out, came back 10 minutes later with a bouquet of beach grass and a bottle of white wine. "You're lucky you're pretty," she said. "You're lucky I'm exhausted," he shot back. She liked that they weren't pretending to be anyone else. She liked that his hands were rougher now, that he started leaving books half-read around her porch. He liked that she still read the newspaper with her fingers tracing the print, and that she wore his old t-shirt to water the garden without a hint of irony. Then, one evening in early fall, something changed again. They were sitting under the stars, just like that first night, Sinatra crooning in the background, bourbon in hand. The air had a bite to it, summer slipping into memory. He looked over at her and said, "Lydia, if I asked you something crazy, would you laugh?" She didn't even flinch. "Probably. What if I bought the inn?" She blinked and stayed. For real. No more aliases. Just me, wood chopping and overcooking scallops and walking this shore till my bones give out. She didn't laugh. Instead, she reached over, took his glass, sipped from it slowly, and said, "Then I'd better show you how to make a proper pie crust. Because that one you left me." "Hey, I tried." "William," she interrupted, leaning closer, "you're not a bad man. You're just a man who forgot he was allowed to be ordinary. And I think maybe it's time you remembered." That night, he didn't go back to room 8. He stayed in the guest room of Lydia's house. And the pie crust they made the next morning? Perfect. It wasn't always smooth. By November, the days grew short and sharp. Wind whipped off the coast like something feral, and the sea turned the color of old pewter. William, because no one called him Brad anymore, spent his mornings chopping wood behind the inn and his evenings on Lydia's couch, sometimes reading, sometimes just listening to the storm rage outside. And they bickered, not cruelly, but honestly. He left his shoes in the hallway. She rearranged his books alphabetically. He'd forget the laundry in the machine for days. She hated when he whistled while washing dishes. One morning, after he accidentally burned her favorite cast-iron pan, Lydia stood with her arms crossed, flour on her cheek, and said flatly, "You are a beautiful nuisance." He blinked. "You think I'm beautiful?" She didn't smile. "I think you know damn well you're beautiful. Now go buy me a new pan." They fought like people who planned to stay. And that was the difference. In early December, he told her about the rehab, the drinking, the nights he couldn't remember, the things he wished he didn't. She didn't flinch. Instead, she walked over to the cabinet, pulled out her husband's old AA chip, the last one he earned before the cancer came, and placed it in William's palm. "I didn't save him," she whispered, "but I think maybe I was still meant to hold space for someone." He looked at her, speechless. And that night, he slept beside her for the first time. Nothing happened. No grand passion. Just breathing, shoulder to shoulder, two souls finally allowed to rest. By Christmas, the inn was his. Eileen retired with a generous check and a handmade quilt from Lydia. The townsfolk adjusted quickly. They always had, really. As long as he kept the place quiet, kept the coffee strong and the beds warm, no one cared who he used to be. He decorated room 8 with his own paintings, landscapes mostly, quiet things. Lydia teased him about his obsession with fog, but kept every canvas he gave her. On New Year's Eve, they sat on the back porch in silence, wrapped in blankets, sipping cider. "I don't want a wedding," she said suddenly. "Don't even think about proposing." He raised an eyebrow. "Wouldn't dream of it." She glanced sideways. "You were." "Maybe a little." They clinked mugs and let the fireworks go off unseen. And yet, as winter passed into spring, something deeper started to grow. Not louder, just stronger. He took up cooking classes at the community center. She taught art to local kids once a week. They started a small herb garden behind the inn, where she labeled everything in cursive, and he kept accidentally pulling up the mint thinking it was weeds. There were bad days, still. Mornings when the past crept in, when headlines reached even this far corner of Maine, when someone left a tabloid on the inn's front desk by accident. But Lydia knew how to quiet storms. Not with answers, but with presence. She didn't try to fix him. She just stayed. And one rainy April morning, when he opened the cabinet to find the pie tin gone, she held up a fresh one. Perfect crust, perfect filling, daisy tucked in the edge. "No one's perfect," she said, sliding it into the oven. "But this pie is damn close." He grinned, walked over, and kissed her forehead. Not because it was a romantic moment, but because it was real. It was a Thursday when the letter came. Not an email, not a call. An actual letter on creamy, expensive stationery, slipped into the mailbox behind the inn as if it had been hand-delivered. No return address. Just his name, William Bradley Pitt, in a script too elegant to belong to a stranger. He stared at it for a long time before opening it. Lydia stood nearby, weeding the thyme bed. She didn't ask. She never did. When he read it, he sat down on the porch step and said nothing for 10 full minutes. Then he handed it to her. The letter was from his ex-wife. Not Angelina. The first one. Jennifer. It wasn't dramatic. Just a few pages, written with care. She'd heard, somehow, about Bar Harbor, about the inn, about the woman with silver hair who walked beside him every morning. And she didn't sound bitter. Only soft, wistful. She wrote about forgiveness, about how some loves don't end, they just live in another shape. How she hoped he'd finally found stillness, and that maybe, when he was ready, he could write back. He didn't say much after that. Just folded the letter, slid it into the drawer next to Lydia's crossword books, and went back to chopping onions for dinner. That night, he was quiet. They ate on the porch like always. The sky was velvet and the air smelled like salt and thyme. He poured her wine and said, "Did you ever think there were versions of yourself that lived entire lifetimes you'll never get to meet again?" She took a long sip. "Sure. But I think we carry them. In the way we walk. The way we grieve." He looked at her then, not like a man haunted, but like a man finally willing to stop running. "She was good," he said. "Jen, I wasn't. But we were kids. And Hollywood is a place that grows egos faster than hearts." Lydia reached across the table and touched his hand. "You don't owe me your guilt," she said gently. "You only owe me your honesty." He laughed softly. "That's more terrifying." But he wrote back. He didn't tell Lydia what he wrote, and she didn't ask. She only smiled when he walked to the post office himself the next morning, his letter sealed, his name written clearly this time. No pseudonyms. No hiding. In May, someone else showed up. It was his daughter, Shiloh. Not with cameras. Not with security. Just a rental car and a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She looked like him, same eyes, same quiet. He was in the garden when she arrived, kneeling in the dirt, hands muddy from transplanting basil. He didn't hear the car until she was already out, standing there in jeans and a faded Ramones t-shirt, looking at him like she didn't know whether to cry or laugh. "Dad," she said, and his whole world cracked wide open. He dropped the trowel, ran to her, held her like he was afraid she'd vanish. Lydia watched from the porch, silent, a hand over her heart. They spent hours talking. On the back porch, in the herb garden, walking the shore. She asked about the inn. About Lydia. About the driftwood fort he rebuilt. That night, the three of them ate dinner together. Lydia made her famous lemon chicken. William opened a bottle of wine he'd been saving. And Shiloh, somewhere between the salad and dessert, looked at them both and said, "I've never seen you like this." "Like what?" he asked. "Like someone who knows where he belongs." He didn't answer. Just looked at Lydia. And for the first time, he let himself believe it. The letter came in early June. It was addressed to Lydia, written in sharp block letters like someone afraid of curves. Postmarked from Oregon. She stared at it for a while before opening it, sitting on the front step with the morning sun warming her knees. William was still asleep, curled sideways in the bed they now shared most nights, arms wrapped around the pillow like a man who'd finally stopped bracing for loss. She read it once, then again, then folded it and placed it in the back pocket of her jeans like it was something half alive. She didn't tell him right away. That day, they went to the farmer's market, bought too many strawberries. He tried to haggle with a 9-year-old selling mint, and she called him a washed-up movie star with no sense of economy, which made everyone around them laugh. Later, they lay in the grass near the cliffs, side by side, just listening to the gulls. He reached for her hand, and she let him hold it like it was something old and familiar. That night, she finally spoke. "It was from my sister," she said softly. He looked up from his book. "We haven't spoken in almost 20 years. She didn't come to the funeral. Said she couldn't face the grief. Said she thought I'd hated her for it." William sat up slowly. "Waited. She's in remission. Breast cancer. Stage 2. Wants to see me." She didn't cry. Lydia didn't cry much anymore. But her voice went quiet in that way he'd learned meant the ground was shifting beneath her. "Will you go?" he asked. "I think I have to." He nodded. "Then I'll pack your things." She looked at him, startled. "I'm coming with you, LID." She shook her head. "This isn't your mess to step into." He took her face gently in both hands. "I left every mess I ever made for someone else to clean up. I won't do it again. Not with you." So they went. Drove across the country in the same gray pickup he'd arrived in a year ago, now rusted at the edges, radio crackling with bad country songs and NPR depending on the state. They stopped at cheap motels. Ate gas station sandwiches. Made love under motel quilts with cigarette burns in them and laughed about how romance didn't need luxury, it needed loyalty. Her sister, Mary Ann, met them in a quiet garden in Bend, Oregon. She was smaller than Lydia remembered, more fragile. But when they hugged, Lydia didn't feel 20 years of silence. She felt her mother's voice, her father's laugh, a whole childhood being stitched back together. William stood off to the side, watching. Later, Marian pulled him aside. "She looks good," she said. "Like herself again." He nodded. "She's more herself than I think she's ever been." She squinted at him. "You're him, aren't you?" He smiled slightly. "Not anymore." They stayed 3 weeks. And when they returned to Bar Harbor, it was late July. The air was thick with salt and pine and tourists, but room 8 was waiting. So was the driftwood fort, still standing. Lydia walked into the inn like it had always been hers. William followed, carrying her bag. They didn't marry. They didn't need to. But every Thursday morning, he left a daisy on her pillow. And every night, she folded his socks the way he hated, just to hear him grumble. People came and went. Some recognized him. Some didn't. But no one asked questions anymore. Because some stories don't need to be explained, only lived. And some lives don't need saving. Only someone to stay long enough to rebuild the fort when the tide takes it down.